while we're talking about automation, there was this aspect that I was talking to you about, and this is closer to my heart because I have worked in API security testing for a long time. This is on the offensive side of security, right? The API security testing. And I think that's the first elephant in the room that I want to address. In terms of automating API security testing, how do we actually, to the first question, how do we actually standardize and automate the testing for our set of APIs? But while we do that, I will also like you to go maybe one level deeper and tell us about the authentication challenges, because one of the first things that I saw when we were doing this, and we would do that for every project, right, separately, because we were on the consulting side. But for an organization that's trying to set up a security testing framework for themselves in APIs, there can be, for any mid-size to large-size organization, they'll have multiple authentication mechanisms for these APIs that will be spread across, and it may not be uniform, it may not be single. So how do they take care of or handle or tackle this or automate authentication for these APIs? Because that's a fundamental part. So you have to authenticate to the API when you're testing, and if you want to automate that process, it can become a challenge if there are multiple authentication schemes spread across. So how do you standardize it, automate, and then how do you take care of the authentication?
Yeah, it's on an average, I think based on what I have seen. Actually, let me start with the maximum number of unique authentication schemes that are used in a company that I have seen is 20 actually. There
Oh
were
my
like
God,
literally in a
20.
single company, there are like 20 different authentications. When I say 20 unique, basically
Okay.
there were like even combinations. So there were cases, header is named as X-API key. In some cases, it was just API key is the header.
Were they
Um,
selling authentication by any chance?
no, if you actually go back, the reason it happens is in today's world, like let's go back to the fundamentals, right? We want every business to innovate, move fast, innovate, and the business needs to move fast so that they grow as a business. And in that process, all the digital teams or development teams, whatever you call it, they are given autonomy. I think that has become the new culture, right? For the right reasons. So they can pick some of these frameworks, they can use some of the cloud services, and they can start moving fast. And it's a byproduct of that, because everybody is trying to do the right thing by moving fast and innovating. But in that process, if the same standard is not used across the different services, across different teams or different BUs, it is bound to happen.
Yeah.
They're not using the exact same code to actually authenticate service A and service B, basically. So that's how we end up with this situation. And to answer to your question, how do you automate it? First, you should know that there are actually 20. And it again goes
Yeah.
back to the discovery. So let's first define discovery, right? I have seen different definitions. Some people just list the paths and they call that as a API discovery. Yeah, you can
Okay.
say that, but you will not be in a position to answer or automate the things like authentication automation that you pointed. So in my opinion, whatever solution you are building to actually discover these APIs or the portal that you are building, it cannot just be at the superficial level just by looking at the paths. You have to go much deeper, inspect all the authentication details, and like make a note of all these unique authentication schemes that you are seeing across the board. And then that discovery or the portal feeds into this automation. So on the even though it might sound daunting, there are only finite number of authentication schemes. Like you put it in a header, the authentication tokens, you put it in the header, or in some cases they might even put it in the query. But even in the header, it might be a plain API key, or it might be a JWT token. You might use OAuth. The number of approaches are only finite, and you can just automate it very easily. So the real challenge is not how do you codify these finite authentication mechanisms. The real challenge is actually finding how many different authentication mechanisms that we have, and that again can be solved with the automation of the discovery, and your discovery solving this. So that would go a long way. So when you are finding, note down all the unique authentication mechanisms you have and take one by one, and there will be like even half a dozen in an average enterprise, and you can just write the code. There are a lot of Python authenticators to automate it very easily.
Will it also involve integrations with these systems or with IDPs within the organization?
Yes, it does involve. Great question. Because again, going one more level deeper in the authentication, right? When you're authenticating, the cases like a long-lived API keys, which obviously is not a very good practice for security, but there are some companies and some some cases they might be using. Those are relatively easy because in the automated security testing, you can just put it once and it will just work across each run. But rather a better security practice is to generate short-lived tokens with much lesser TTL on the fly. And in those cases, you need to talk to the authentication system or IDP back. So you usually provide it with the username, password, and if MFA is enabled, that's where it actually gets to the next level, the whole implementation. You might have to you give a MFA token, or you might have to even programmatically uh, click captchas. So I'll tell there's a Python framework called Playwright. So that you can actually open a browser and automatically do things that you can only do in the browser, because these days it is very common. The most complex that I see usually is one is introducing captchas. And if there is no captcha, because the original token retrieval originally happens through this web application or mobile application, in both of the cases, you validate the captcha. So that's why I've seen cases where API authentication, you cannot even get the token without actually having a mobile or web app. Uh, for the right reasons, I think. So in those cases, the frameworks like Playwright will be helpful. And there are even other cases where you can programmatically verify the TOTP kind of thing. So go through all those cases. But again, those are all codified, and a lot of times you actually find online programs to deal with this. In my opinion, in the enterprises, the bigger challenge was actually identifying that we have all these mechanisms.
Yeah, I think practical scenarios, the things that sound very simple are actually the most difficult to do. That's what my experience is. Just I think, but we are still trying to go one level deeper to understand. If you have solved this, and I'm sure it will take some time to figure that out also, and understand what all mechanisms are there, map it to the APIs that you have, and do the right kind of integrations wherever necessary. But the kind of tokens that you were talking about, does it apply to the JWT tokens as well? Like, or is it different when you want to add those to your authentication?
It is for JWT tokens as well. Like actually, the most common that I have seen is actually using the JWT token, because it has become a fairly common practice. And JWT token with short-lived tokens, like half an hour, 1 hour is generally the common thing that we have seen. In staging pre-prod environments, they set it to half a day or 1 day because it's not production. In all these cases, the authentication automation, the way it involves is you take the user credentials usually, and if MFA is not enabled, you just basically hit a authentication endpoint and you pass these credentials, you exchange it for a token, and in some cases you have a refresh token, and the refresh token can
Yeah.
be used to continuously refresh and get the new access tokens. And the automation of the security testing needs to be aware of this, and it needs to be smart enough to detect when the authentication has expired, the token has expired, based on the response codes that you get in the API calls. And based on that, you again go repeat the same process and get the token on the fly and pass it in the subsequent calls.
Cool. I think, yeah, this sort of sounds like most important problems solved for API.